More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
This is the government of our nation, the same government that tore away the rights of hundreds of thousands of innocent Japanese Americans, condemned its own citizens without cause, and later attempted to bury this cruelty under the empty excuse of calling it just a mistake. The wrongful incarceration of Japanese Americans is crucial to Asian American studies because it exposes how the US has used race and national security to justify the violation of Asian American rights. This topic shows how Japanese Americans were treated as an enemy through racism and manipulation by the government. Academically, it provides a key example for understanding how government policies, media narratives, and public fear create and reinforce white supremacy. This issue continues today, as the government still abuses its power through aggressive immigration enforcement and the forced deportation of many marginalized ethnic communities through the contribution of a tyrant.
Let me ask you about another group of people, the estimated 4 million families in America who have mixed immigration status. So I'm talking about parents who might be here illegally, but the kids are here legally.
Citizens and aliens alike would have to move.
I don't want to be breaking up families, so the only way you don't break up the family is you keep them together and you have to send them all back.
This is the importance of this issue, considering citizens from different ethnic backgrounds are facing forced removals by its own government. Today I'll be jumping back all the way to 1941 and speaking about how the US government during World War II manipulated public perception of Japanese Americans to justify their forced removal and mass incarceration. The US government created a narrative of Japanese American disloyalty that was driven by white supremacy, who were accountable for authorizing racial fear and suppress injustice. The government's strategic propaganda was a solution to justifying the mass incarceration of an innocent community. Firstly, I will introduce my first primary source, the Japanese relocation film, produced by the Office of War Information on November 12, 1942. This film is valuable to my research because it is a key example of wartime propaganda designed to shape how Americans are to view Japanese Americans during World War II. This film aims to persuade the public for their actions as a safety measure, using strategic imagery and terminology to hide the violation of civil rights and the operation of the Japanese American incarceration.
Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort.
In this specific clip, we can hear the speaker using the words migration, evacuee, assembly centers, and the term sacrifice. The government's film uses misleading language to disguise the violence of incarceration by calling the forced removal a migration and evacuation. These two words makes it seem voluntary rather than an order backed by the military. The speaker labels imprisoned citizens as evacuees, suggesting they were being protected rather than them being stripped off their rights. The film also describes the camps as assembly centers, which hides the reality of barbed wire, guards, and confinement. The film even frames the loss of homes, freedom, and dignity as a sacrifice, implying Japanese Americans willingly gave up everything for the country's safety. This terminology covers up the injustice and shifts blame away from the US government, turning a civil rights violation into a patriotic duty. My first secondary source is an article published by the National Park Service titled Terminology and the Mass Incarceration of Japanese Americans During World War II. The article's central argument is that words matter. The article states, the selection of particular words by an individual or by consensus within an organization may also serve ideological or political purposes. The article analyzes the US government's World War II era vocabulary and addresses the language as purposely to soften and hide the reality of a state ordered race based mass removal. The article also states the US government used newsreels and press coverage to portray the forced mass removal, confinement, and dispersal in a benign light. Spokespeople use carefully chosen words and images to communicate these processes, the places where people were being confined, and the people themselves. This quote is effective considering it reveals the many strategies the US government used in newsreels, press coverage, and carefully chosen language. The government made the mass removal and imprisonment look harmless and necessary through these actions. This article strengthens my research because it proves that propaganda didn't just support incarceration, it actively justified it by making mass removal and imprisonment appear necessary and harmless. This article gives me similar examples of how language functioned as a tool of manipulation. This connection reinforces my claim that government controlled messaging was critical to justifying the violation of Japanese Americans' civil rights. Moving on to my next secondary source, it is an article titled Japanese Americans and the Making of U.S. Democracy During World War II by Gary Okihiro. Okihiro argues that U.S. claims about democracy during World War II, but a contradiction is made by the unfair treatment of Japanese Americans. He shows how government propaganda blurred the line between Japan and Japanese Americans, and reframed forced removal as orderly, protective, and even civilizing. The article highlights themes of racism, white supremacy, state propaganda, and censorship. Gary reveals the gap between the democratic rhetoric practice and Japanese American citizenship. Okihiro article links with my research because it analyzes the same film. However, he adds a different strategy that the US government implied apart from intentional language. Gary mentions the controlling of the public perception and the myth of Japanese Americans potentially being a threat since they live closer to critical and exposing areas of the country.
Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. But of course, this limited evacuation was a solution to only part of the problem.
In the following quote, Gary speaks on the idea of the film and uses specific words from the speaker in the Japanese relocation film to prove this. Gary states, "The Office of War Information, it should be noted, controlled the news the American public received of the war, and its primary purpose was to promote patriotism and present the U.S. war effort in the most favorable light. Japanese in the film's title blurred the distinction between the Japanese enemy and the Japanese Americans. The film's narrator states, proved potentially dangerous living and working as they did along vital harbors and near airfields. Their relocation was prudent and necessary. The job, perhaps offensive to some, was made easier knowing that it was being conducted as a democracy should, and involved cheerful and cooperative Japanese." This quote shows how the US propaganda portrayed Japanese Americans as a potentially dangerous threat, making their forced relocation seem prudent and necessary. By describing the process as conducted as democracy should, and emphasizing the cheerful and cooperative behavior of Japanese Americans, the film uses euphemistic language to mask the injustice and justify the mass incarceration. This directly supports my thesis on how racialized fear shaped public perception. Okihiro uses the Office of War Information films and primary sources to demonstrate the cultural contradiction to making a clear case that propaganda helped support the military necessity of removing Japanese Americans. I now shift over to my second primary source, the Executive Order 9066. Executive Order 9066 was a law signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1942 that allowed the U.S. military to force Japanese Americans on the West Coast out of their homes and into incarceration camps. I chose the Executive Order 9066 because it provides clear evidence that the U.S. government knowingly violated the civil rights of Japanese Americans and relied on racist assumptions to justify it. The order's language reveals that the officials understood the extreme nature of their actions, yet they still authorized mass removal based solely on ancestry rather than the proven disloyalty or individual behavior. By targeting people of Japanese descent, citizens and non citizens, the government used race itself as the determining factor for punishment. Analyzing this source shows how the government relied on pre-existing racism against Asians. Long before World War II, the US had laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act and alien land laws that targeted Asian immigrants. Japanese Americans were already seen as outsiders, no matter how long they lived in the US. This made it easier for the government to convince the public that Japanese people were a threat. By framing Japanese ancestry itself as a security threat, they turned a racial group into a danger, making the public accept the removal while ignoring Germans and Italians who were far more numerous and were at the war for the second time against the United States. This directly connects to my thesis because Executive Order 9066 exposes how white supremacist power structures shape federal policy and public perception. The order helped produce the narrative that Japanese Americans were inherently disloyal, giving propaganda the legal and political foundation needed to justify incarceration. It shows that the government did not just react to fear, it actively used racial ideology and ancestry-based suspicion to rationalize the violation of rights. I will now discuss my third secondary source, an article titled Personal Justice Denied, written by Commission on Wartime Relocation and the Internment of Civilians. Personal Justice Denied argues that the incarceration of Japanese Americans resulted from racism, wartime hysteria, and political failure rather than the genuine safety effort of the country. Its central themes include the government's reliance on ancestry-based suspicion, the unequal treatment of Japanese Americans compared to other groups, and the awareness among federal leaders that their actions violated constitutional rights. These arguments directly support my thesis by providing credible evidence that the state intentionally constructed a narrative of Japanese American disloyalty to rationalize mass removal. The article touches up on the shaping of public perception being driven by white supremacy in this following quote in the article. Congress was fully aware of supported the policy of removal and detention. It sanctioned the exclusion by enacting a statute which made criminal the violation of orders issued pursuant to Executive Order 9066. The United States Supreme Court held the exclusion constitutionally permissible in the context of war. In this quote from the source, it is valuable because it uses an official government report that directly contradicts the wartime propaganda narrative of Japanese Americans being a threat. This gives my research strong credibility by confirming that white leaders influence government decisions far more than the genuine security needs. The source also makes it clear that the government knew these actions were racist and unconstitutional, yet they still carried them out, revealing a conscious decision was made to prioritize prejudice over civil rights by white structural power. Now that I've explained how the sources exposes where the authority and permission came from to make this removal possible, the article also reveals the actions and strategy of using ancestry to justify the removal of Japanese Americans after having the green light by the Constitution. The article also states, it runs counter to a basic premise on which American nation of immigrant is built, that loyalty to the United States is a matter of individual choice and not determined by the ties of ancestral country. In this case, German Americans, the First World War, demonstrated that race did not determine loyalty, and no negative assumption was made with regard to citizens of German or Italian descent during the Second World War. The second judgment was by the general's own admission, unsupported by any evidence. General DeWitt's recommendation clearly does not provide a credible rationale based on military expertise for the necessity of exclusion. Overall, Personal Justice Denied reinforces my thesis by showing that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was not a matter of security reasons, but a deliberate, racially motivated policy supported by white-controlled institutions. The source demonstrates that the government not only had legal authority to act, but also knowingly used ancestry as a justification for violating constitutional rights. By revealing both the discriminatory reasoning and the conscious choice to ignore evidence of loyalty, the report highlights how propaganda and official policy work together to shape public perception and normalize injustice. To continue my third and final primary source, I will be using an interview titled I Was Sent to U.S. Concentration Camp, I Was There, featuring Paul Tomita.
Our civil rights were suspended. I was 3 years old. White America chose to punish Japanese-looking faces. I somehow survived. 79 years later, I'm still here.
I chose this as my primary source because it provides a first-hand account from someone who directly experienced Japanese American incarceration. Personal testimonies give insight into the real-life consequences of government policies, which cannot be fully understood through official reports by the government. This perspective is essential for the examining of the human impact of propaganda and racialized policies.
And again, suicide. The suicides went up. And many psychiatrists and psychologists said everybody, including children who were in that camp situation, they will have at least diagnosis PTSD. At least that.
This source goes beyond summarizing events. It reviews the emotional and physical hardship endured by Japanese Americans in the camps, including loss of freedom, harsh living conditions, and psychological trauma. The speaker account exposes the gap between the government portrayal of the camps as a safe and normal and the harsh reality by the internees.
Would have a difficulty breathing, so I would go to the hospitals. I didn't want to be there because I'd be there alone, so my goal was to escape. And
by highlighting these experiences, the source demonstrates how propaganda concealed the truth and normalized injustice. The testimony directly supports my thesis that the US government used propaganda by concealing the real truth to justify the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. It provides evidence of the human cost of white supremacist driven narratives of disloyalty and illustrates how propaganda suppressed the truth while avoiding accountability.
The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held
This first-hand perspective strengthens my argument by showing that the government's strategic messaging was not only misleading, but also harmful to an innocent community. My fourth secondary source is an article written by Alison McNerney titled U.S. Propaganda Film Shows Normal Life in World War II Japanese Internment Camps. This article argues the U.S. government propaganda intentionally portrayed Japanese American internment camps as safe, orderly, and even cheerful despite the harsh realities of forced incarceration. The major themes include the manipulation of public perception through media and the false government messaging. This source is important because it provides clear evidence of white leaders used the media to shape public opinion in favor of policies that violated civil rights. It directly supports my thesis because it demonstrates how the government constructed a narrative of Japanese American disloyalty through another strategic method by validating the mass removal. By highlighting the discrepancy between the cheerful approach presented in films and the actual suffering of internees, the article illustrates a deliberate misrepresentation that reinforced public acceptance of injustice. In the article, the author claims, brother of then General and future President Dwight D. Eisenhower shows footage of forced removals and paints the prison camps in the most positive of light. This quote shows how the US government deliberately censored the harsh reality of internment camps, portraying forced removals in a positive light to make the camps appear safe and normal. This allows for the contradiction to be exposed through my primary source, Paul Tomita, who explains the complete opposite. The conditions of internment camps were hidden for the government to manipulate the public to thinking they were normal and safe. My fifth and final secondary source is the article named The Unwritten Record by Matthew Margus. This article argues that government-produced propaganda films about Japanese American internment were designed to present the camps as well-managed and acceptable. A key theme is the tension between the U.S. democratic ideals and the reality of racialized policies, showing how propaganda masked systemic injustice. It also explores the collaboration between multiple government agencies and the film industry to influence public opinion. This emphasizes the strategic and coordinated nature of this messaging. This source is valuable because it examines government intent and method, not just outcomes. Unlike some historical accounts that focus on camp conditions alone, it situates propaganda within broader wartime strategy, demonstrating how the US government actively shaped narratives to justify the incarceration. For example, the author states, the WRA collaborated to make films intended for several different audiences. The films are most definitely propaganda, but they review points of tension between the actions of the government and the democratic ideals the nation was fighting a war to defend. This article directly supports my thesis by showing that the government deliberately created narratives of Japanese disloyalty and silenced the truth about camp conditions. It also connects to my thesis because of the propaganda and racial fear, highlighting the collaboration of multiple agencies to create a use of film as a form to manipulate public perception. My research builds on this by linking these propaganda efforts to white supremacist power structures and emphasizing how such messaging justified mass incarceration while avoiding accountability. In conclusion, the US government strategically shaped public perception of Japanese Americans to justify their mass incarceration through carefully chosen language, executive documents, and media narratives that frame internees as disloyal. White power structures played a critical role in supporting these efforts, from influencing public opinion through the passing of Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced removal and imprisonment of innocent community, and by concealing the harsh realities of internment camps, the government mass injustice, and normalized racial oppression. Together, these strategies reveal how systemic white supremacy and propaganda worked hand in hand to suppress truth, manipulate perception, and validate a severe injustice and violation of civil rights. Through researching this topic, I learned how deeply the US government are able to get away with such injustice. Studying these events revealed the essential role of white power structures in enabling and enforcing systemic racial injustice. It reveals how government authority can be abused to suppress truth and violate civil rights. This topic is crucial for understanding the consequences of unchecked power and the importance of holding leaders accountable.